The end of the Second World War was met with riotous jubilation at victory over the Axis powers, and with the establishment of the United Nations, there was the dream of a new world order of freedom, prosperity, and peace. Even the advent of the atom bomb, the decisive weapon that ended the war, was celebrated, for it was believed it was so powerful it would render warfare obsolete. And yet, even before the guns fell silent, concerned whispers were being shared in the halls of power regarding the capitalist allies of the West and the communists in the East, who hitherto had been united against fascism. With there no longer being a common enemy to unite them, age-old rivalries and fears began to re-emerge. The Western allies of Britain, Canada, France, and America had not forgotten that the Soviet leader Stalin had worked with the Nazis to carve up Eastern Europe before Germany invaded Poland in 1939. They were also concerned about Stalin's refusal to surrender his grip on territories in Eastern Europe, which the Red Army had liberated, and his land grab in Asia during his last-minute intervention in the Pacific Theater against Japan. Stalin himself, as paranoid as ever, was convinced that the Western Allies deliberately delayed the D-Day landings in order to bleed the Soviet Union of its people in an effort to weaken the vast country. The fact that American soldiers had fought in the Russian Civil War against the Communists in 1919 only helped fuel his belief that after Napoleon and Hitler, the next leader to take a massive army into the Soviet Union would be American. With both America and the Soviet Union having suffered devastating surprise attacks in the war, they were both determined it would never happen again. They readied their armies to fight what would prove to be one of the most abstract conflicts in history, the Cold War. Welcome to Wars of the World. In 1945, West Germany was integrated into NATO, which the Soviets condemned as a destabilizing move. In response, they had their Eastern European allies sign the Treaty of Friendship, Cooperation, and Mutual Assistance, more commonly known as the Warsaw Pact. The alliance was intended to counter NATO in Europe, but functioned differently to its Western equivalent. While the US influence in NATO was extensive, it was not absolute, whereas the Warsaw Pact was essentially an extension of the Soviet armed forces. In this way, Stalin was able to maintain his grip on the Warsaw Pact countries by denying them their ability to operate independently. And so, while NATO countries were granted access to the latest US weapon systems under the Mutual Assistance Program, the Warsaw Pact countries were provided with inferior versions of Soviet equipment, leading many to speculate that the Soviets saw the Warsaw Pact countries as mere cannon fodder, to be expended in the opening days of a conflict with the technologically superior NATO armies. The Cold War was a time of unprecedented secrecy. Knowing what the other side was doing offered enormous advantages in the diplomatic arena of the United Nations, where both sides regularly faced each other directly to challenge the other on their activities. The Cold War spy network has become the stuff of legend, being glamorized in popular culture, but it was often nowhere near as glitzy as James Bond. On the contrary, it was a highly dangerous and often dirty endeavor, where capture could mean either a lengthy prison sentence, or in some cases, simply vanishing off the face of the earth. As early as 1950, US and British aircraft began flying reconnaissance missions around and sometimes in Soviet airspace. The Soviets retaliated on April 8, 1950, shooting down a US spy plane, the first of many that would be shot down by Soviet defenses during the Cold War, when in 1956, a Soviet warship brought Nikita Khrushchev to Britain, the man who would replace Stalin when he died as the leader of the Soviet Union. A Royal Navy frogman named Lionel Crabb was found weeks later with his head missing. A Soviet diver later confessed to killing Crabb because he was spotted attempting to attach a device to the Soviet vessel. The Western powers were not afraid to deliberately violate Soviet territory in order to gather intelligence. RAF crews flying American RB-45 Tornado reconnaissance planes flew routes that bombers would take to attack targets in Eastern Europe to study how dense the defenses were. Meanwhile, the US developed the secretive U-2 spy plane, which flew at extremely high altitude above Soviet defenses to spy on Soviet bases. However, Soviet defenses became more and more advanced, and on May 1st, 1960, a U-2 was shot down inside Soviet territory, and its pilot, Francis Gary Powers, was captured and put on trial, much to the embarrassment of the US. The Soviets lacked the technology to build an equivalent U-2, but both sides would later start spying on the other with spy satellites. It was actually a picture by a Soviet spy satellite that gave the world its first glimpse of the notorious Area 51 facility in Nevada. Nuclear-powered submarines from both sides would also spend a great deal of time spying on each other, and on more than one occasion, there were collisions between vessels, perhaps the most serious of which was when the Soviet submarine K-314 collided with the American carrier USS Kitty Hawk in 1984. Spies from both sides would operate undercover, apparently living normal lives in the country of their adversary, while gathering data on military and political activity. In the UK, a group which came to be known as the Cambridge Five passed information to the Soviet Union during the 1950s. Despite being uncovered, their operation greatly shook the confidence the US had in British counterintelligence, which saw the US briefly withhold some of its own intelligence from British sources. However, no side was ever clean of enemy spies within its ranks. While the Cambridge Five were being uncovered, the British had recruited Colonel Oleg Penkovsky of the Soviet military intelligence to provide them with information, while Americans Julius and Ethel Rosenberg were arrested in 1950 for having been Soviet spies since 1942. Both were found guilty and executed by electric chair. Spies continued to be uncovered in all areas of society on both sides of the Iron Curtain, right up to and even after the end of the Cold War. (1956) was a troublesome year for both sides of the Iron Curtain. On the island of Cuba, located some 90 miles from the US mainland, communist rebels renewed their efforts to oust the pro-US Cuban leadership. On April 29th, Cuban rebels attacked an army barracks, and although they were repelled, it emboldened rebel sympathizers so much that the communist leaders who were in exile returned to Cuba. Among them was Fidel Castro. Just 2 years later, Castro would come to power, much to the glee of Moscow. In the meantime, however, the new Soviet leader Khrushchev had to deal with an uprising in Hungary. Beginning on October 23rd and lasting over 2 weeks, the uprising was opposed to the ruling government, who were seen as Soviet puppets. Soviet troops poured into Budapest to put down the uprising, but not before over 2,500 people had been killed, and over 200,000 Hungarians displaced as refugees. While the Hungarians were rising up, British and French forces were rallying in the Mediterranean to storm the Suez Canal, which had been nationalized by the Egyptian president and was under threat by fighting between Egypt and Israel. It would transpire that the Egypt-Israeli conflict had been orchestrated by London and Paris as an excuse to bring the canal back under Western control and keep it open to Anglo-French shipping, who would otherwise have to sail around Africa to maintain trade with the Far East. The Anglo-French forces defeated the Egyptians and landed their troops on the banks of the canal, but it would prove a political disaster. The US President Dwight D. Eisenhower was furious that he was not consulted beforehand and felt that the operation was a distraction from the Hungarian situation. He threatened to withdraw financial support to both countries if they did not withdraw, and so Britain and France retreated in embarrassment. For Britain, it finally proved they were no longer the great power they once were, and they would have to settle for being a major regional power in Europe. France, on the other hand, was furious with the American response, and this signaled a marked deterioration in relations that threatened its membership in NATO. In the ongoing quest to one-up the other, both sides of the Iron Curtain invested huge resources into developing faster and more effective ways to deliver nuclear bombs against the other. Bombers were still seen as the most effective way, with extremely advanced and futuristic types, such as the XB-70 Valkyrie being developed, which, in theory, could bypass any defenses it came up against with its high-speed, high-altitude performance. However, rocketry was seen as the future, especially by the Soviets, whose bomber force was always at a disadvantage in terms of technology and bases compared to the West. While the US did have its own rocket program, the Atlas, it was beset by a series of problems. In 1953, the Soviets began work on the immense R-7 multi-stage rocket, which was designed to carry a hydrogen bomb around 4,000 miles at over 20 times the speed of sound. After a failed launch test in which the R-7 caught fire, a successful test was carried out on August 21, 1957, the rocket flying 3,700 miles in a matter of minutes. Just 2 months later, the same type of rocket was used to launch Sputnik into orbit, the first artificial satellite. The launching of Sputnik had an important place in the ongoing Cold War because it demonstrated how advanced Soviet technology was, affording them greater leverage in negotiations. It was also a matter of pride. In 1959, the R-7 became operational, and the Soviets now had a way of threatening US bomber bases with destruction just minutes after the start of hostilities, and before the majority of US air forces could even mobilize. Having largely ironed out the problems with their own Atlas missile system, the US declared they had an equivalent ability to retaliate, just as swiftly as any surprise Soviet missile attack. This was the dawn of the ICBM, the Intercontinental Ballistic Missile, which would, from then on, begin replacing bombers as the primary means to carry the nuclear deterrence of both sides. Like the bomber bases, however, ICBM bases were also vulnerable to attack, since they were large, static targets. Submarines offered the solution. Nuclear-powered submarines could patrol underwater for weeks, carrying an arsenal of nuclear missiles, hidden from the enemy. This would prove to be the ultimate deterrent, since not only could they carry large numbers of missiles, they were extremely difficult to detect. The ICBM changed the rules of the game forever. As more and more ICBMs became operational, the danger grew and grew, since neither side could now confidently attack the other without sustaining massive damage themselves. It was mutually assured destruction, known appropriately as MAD. The arrival of the 1960s heralded a new phase in the Cold War. The Soviet Union, after putting their first satellite in orbit, put the first man into space in April of 1961. A month later, the US put their first astronaut into space as well. Recently elected President John F. Kennedy announced that the US would beat the Soviets to the moon. But just as this laudable ambition began, his administration found their attention set on addressing the communist leadership under Fidel Castro on Cuba. Despite being told by his advisors that Cuba offered no real threat to the US, Kennedy believed that ousting Castro and re-establishing a pro-US government would show the Soviets that he was a force to be reckoned with. He therefore authorized a CIA operation to support anti-communist Cuban exiles based in Nicaragua, in an attempt to invade and overthrow Castro. The CIA told Kennedy that once the invasion began, the Cuban people would join the exiles in fighting Castro's regime. This was a grave underestimation of how much support amongst his people Castro had. On April 17, 1961, the exiles invaded at a secluded spot on Cuba's southern coast called the Bay of Pigs. The invasion was a disaster. Just 24 hours later, the exiles were captured by Castro's forces, and there was no popular uprising against the communist leader. It did, however, make Castro turn to the Soviet Union, demanding greater military support to curb any future US-backed invasion. The Soviet Union responded by secretly sending nuclear missiles to the island. Elsewhere, a massive wall was erected around West Berlin to cut it off entirely from East Germany, to prevent the west of the city being used by defectors attempting to cross the Iron Curtain, or by spies attempting to penetrate it. Known simply as the Berlin Wall, it would come to symbolize the world division throughout the Cold War. That world division only seemed to be worsening as the 60s got into full swing. The two great communist superpowers, China and the Soviet Union, were undergoing a period akin to a political divorce, as the two nations differed on key ideological points, leading to the severing of political ties. Meanwhile, France was growing extremely frustrated with its NATO membership, since NATO refused to help the country hold on to its colonial possessions in Africa. They were also resentful of the influence the US had over NATO, the unwillingness for the US to share advanced nuclear weapons with them, like they were with Britain, and how the US was able to largely undermine French military exports to the alliance with their mutual assistance program. By the end of the decade, France would withdraw from NATO and demand American forces leave their country. In October 1962, a U-2 spy plane over Cuba spotted evidence of Khrushchev's missiles under construction. This sparked the Cuban Missile Crisis, a period of 13 days where the world looked set to erupt in nuclear conflict. Kennedy ordered a blockade of Cuba to stop any more missiles being transported there, while both sides engaged in often clandestine negotiations. In the end, Khrushchev agreed to withdraw the missiles in exchange for the US making a public pledge that they would not invade Cuba in the future. There was also a secret agreement to remove US missiles in Turkey. The whole affair was largely seen as a US victory, but in reality, it was a draw. Pulling back from the brink, the crisis had a profound impact on the foreign policies of both sides. There was more effort in the future to avoid direct confrontation, but this in turn meant that to tackle each other, the superpowers saw their efforts being increasingly redirected through third parties. One such place was the steamy jungles of Southeast Asia, Cambodia, Laos, Thailand, and Vietnam.